I think I've spent my entire career sort of asking, why couldn't that be real? In the developer thought leadership circles, there's kind of a tendency to represent not knowing a thing as like an existential threat, like a chance to do things that I think are really unhinged and creative that just don't really have a place anywhere else. I need to make something that I'm proud of, because if I feel like I'm on a treadmill of making content that's just to please the algorithm, I think that it sort of backs you into being somebody that you don't want to be. To me, that's sort of the bar, is like, how do we push all of the envelopes at the same time?
Hello, Internet. Welcome back to the Code and Content Podcast, the podcast for conversations at the intersection of code and content. Today's guest, Jason Lengstorf, is from CodeTV. That's his enterprise that he's set up, and I was fortunate enough to be part of an episode that we recorded. Sanity sponsored it, of course, of the Web Dev Challenge, and you do need to go and check out that episode. The developers in that episode were Kent C. Dodds, Aaron Francis, Demetrius Clark, and Charlie Girard. It was a really great time, and it was amazing to me to see the production of it get to take place. You watch the video and it just looks like a bunch of people hanging out writing code, and that's the vibe that definitely those shows go for. But the amount of work going into it behind the scenes, Jason's an absolute pro, and he is doing work that I don't think anybody else is on the same scale or with the same ambition. So I wanted to talk to him all about that. We got in all sorts of topics, but sit back, enjoy this chat with Jason. Jason, thanks for your time. Thanks for joining me on the Code and Content Podcast today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Now, I was just saying before we started recording, but I do love your video shot. So if you're listening on the podcast, you have to at least look on the YouTube. And I'm sure you've seen Jason's videos before, but I always feel like I've been pulled into the teacher's office when I see your videos. So it looks great.
Yeah, I feel like I got kind of sick of always looking at just, the neck up shot, and I wanted something that was a little more interesting. And then I got into a little bit of the production design of like, how do you make a background feel nice, and how do you motivate lighting and all of this kind of stuff. And this rabbit hole is deep. You can just keep going for, I honestly, I don't know that there's a bottom to it. I think you just keep going forever.
For sure. I'd love to do something more creative, but my office is about the size of a phone box. I can touch just about every wall in here from where I'm standing. So, but maybe those constraints is where you get great creativity. So
it is, and it's also this is the slippery slope. Is you're like, oh, you know what? If I had a little bit more space, I could do something more interesting. And the next thing you know, you're renting a 2,000 square foot studio so that you can build a fake office.
Actually, we were just having that discussion today. We're planning a recording of some content for ourselves soon for a new product launch that we've got, and we're like, what if we could set up like a late night talk show to interview customers in that format? And I'm like, this suddenly starts to feel like a Jason Lengstorf CodeTV sort of production, because you're who I think of now in terms of really ambitious content. And that's sort of what I'd like to talk about a lot today, is that nobody's doing content in our developer space like you are. You're taking on big, ambitious productions. So how did you land there doing what you're doing now?
I got here because I think I've spent my entire career sort of asking, why couldn't that be real? And that's led me down a lot of interesting paths, and when I was in a band, I was like, well, why couldn't I be a full-time musician? And then as the band started, the realities of being a full-time musician sort of sank in. I was like, maybe that's not exactly what I want, but why couldn't I be, do the same thing I've been doing for this band? Because I had learned web design and design and a bunch of, administrative stuff and management stuff by running the band, because I was kind of our de facto booking agent, de facto tour manager and stuff. And so it's like, well, why couldn't I just do this for other people? And that turned into an agency. And I just keep asking that question. I'll see a possibility and say, well, is there any reason I couldn't do that? And when I eventually ended up at Netlify, we were doing events, and this was like 2000, I joined in, I think 2018, 2019. And even then, before the pandemic happened, it just felt like we were hitting saturation with a certain type of event, local meetups were working, but there was a lot of same happening in local meetups. Company events, same deal. You'd go to a company event and they all kind of had exactly the same vibe. So I started wondering, what if we did it differently? And I was pushing toward some different ideas, and then COVID really forced that forward. Where it was like, okay, well, we can't throw in-person events anymore. So what's next? everybody was doing Zoom calls, everybody was doing webinars. There was a wave of startups that were all trying to figure out what the remote conference experience was going to do. And none of them felt the way that I wanted them to feel. Like I started thinking about what do I enjoy? Like what do I watch that happens remotely that I really, really like? And it was things like the Academy Awards. You know, when you watch an award show, there's a very specific thing happening. And when you watch sports, there's a very specific thing happening. And it's almost better for certain reasons, to watch the Academy Awards from home or to watch sports from home. Because when you go to a sporting event, the event that you get is, the experience that you get is you walk in and you sit in your chair and then you kind of see what's going on, but you don't get commentary. You don't get a lot of close-ups. You don't get replays. You don't get somebody explaining what just happened on the field when the flag got thrown or whatever it was. You don't get context for like why everybody's celebrating if you don't follow a player very closely and they just broke some personal record or something like that.
Yeah.
So you miss all of this background and context. Academy Awards, the same thing. You go and you attend. It's really cool. You're close to all these celebrities, but you're not in the back room. You're not on the red carpet. You don't get to hear the interviews. You don't get to, have anybody talk about like how many times they've won before, or the fact that this particular actress has never been nominated despite everybody knowing who she is forever. Like Demi Moore for The Substance this year got a bunch of awards or nominations that were like first time for her, right? And I was like, really? Like for everything she's done? But I would never have known that if I'd been at the event. You had to watch it with commentary and somebody doing voiceover and providing this extra context. So I was like, well, why couldn't we do that for tech? Why couldn't we make the Academy Awards for tech? And so my ideas just started being like, well, I don't want to watch a webinar, but I do want to watch people build. So what if it was closer to the Great British Bake Off than it was to a standard, webinar? I don't necessarily want to, watch yet another YouTube playlist in a conference, but I would like to see, expert commentators explaining in between talks why certain things are the way they are, doing behind the scenes interviews, or grabbing some experts to add some commentary or background to what was just talked about on stage. To me, that's fascinating, right? And so I just started pushing toward it at Netlify, and I wasn't able to get the buy-in that I wanted there. We did some things. We got to do some really amazing projects while we were there, but I was shooting higher, and it just coupled with the tech downturn and all the things that happened around the industry. So I decided it was time for me to just, I couldn't get it out of my head. I was like, this is possible. So I was like, if I'm going to do it, I guess I got to do it on my own. And so I started up, then Learn with Jason, which I've renamed now to CodeTV.
Yeah.
And it's taking a run at it. Let's see what we can do.
Yeah. All those other sort of formats of content you speak about, like they are either advertisements or they are educational, your conference talks, those sorts of things. Whereas,
Right.
so you're sort of primarily creating something that's entertaining first, and then like just happens to be educational, it happens to be interesting, and that's
Right.
I think has always made a great conference talk, is something that's entertaining first. I come to have a good time,
Right.
where and hopefully you accidentally learn something. So that makes perfect sense. And I think probably around the same time, I don't know if I've just become YouTube obsessed in the last few years, but I feel like YouTube as a type of content and YouTube as a streaming platform has become so popular, especially in the last 18, 24 months. And I know the people who are huge there have been big for a long time, but I know I'm YouTube obsessed. I get the impression you are as well. But is that fair? I watch those creators and think, how can they take that entertainment value and put it to, the content that we're creating, even in some small sort of way? Like, what's working at an entertainment level on YouTube as a digital platform to entertain people? How can I take the lessons from that and keep people engaged for the content that we're creating?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the nice thing about the internet in general is that it's a platform that very much encourages remixing and expansion. And, that was one of the very first things I did when I didn't have budget. I was trying to figure out, how do I prove out this idea that we could make entertaining content that isn't necessarily a straight up tutorial or interview, right? So I started exploring what other creators were doing, and I found this series that I had actually been watching the series, and I kind of realized, like, oh, I could make this. it was Andrew Huang, who's a music producer, and he does a bunch of stuff. But he has a series that he calls Four Producers Flip the Same Sample. And it was, he finds an instrument or a sound or a sample of a song, and he gives it to four different producers. He's usually one of them. And they all have to make a song. And they get a certain amount of time, and then they all turn in their song, and then they do this remotely. They'll record a bit of a walkthrough of like what they made and some interesting parts of the build of the music. Then they all record themselves listening to each other's songs and kind of reacting to that music being played. And I love that show. I would watch it all the time. And then I found out that Andrew Huang actually got that idea from Jessica Cole Basie, who did a series called Four Photographers Shoot the Same Model. And so they would take one location and one model, and four different photographers would kind of do it the way they wanted to do it. And then they would compare how the different photos came out from those shoots and just show how creative you can be, even if you've got the same source. And and there's been like a game version of that show. There's been all sorts of different ways that people have riffed on that content. I was like, oh, I could do this. Like, let me try this. And so I made a version. It was four web devs build the same app idea. Mm-hmm. And I got a few friends to build remotely. We all worked async. We recorded ourselves reacting to each other's apps. And it was super fun. And we got the reaction. Like, we saw people paying attention, and views went up. People were sharing it. There was a lot of commentary. I was like, all right, we're on to something. And so I was able to take that and then use it as a proof point that, like, look, this type of content works. Imagine if we put some budget behind it. And then DataStax was down to take a risk with me. And so they threw some budget at the first episode of Web Dev Challenge, which happened in June of 2024 is when it released. And it was immediately like wildly successful compared to anything I'd ever made before. And we've gone on to do, 10 of those in season 1, and we're making season 2 now, where we've ramped it up even further. And it just, like once we showed people that this was possible, it's been much easier to get people to sort of see the vision and be ready to put a little bit more behind it, because it's pretty clear that this is something that people enjoy. So we just want to make more of it.
And something you just haven't seen before. Like I remember sort of the first time I made contact with the Web Dev Challenge, I'm not sure which episode it was I saw, but it's like I've not seen my industry represented like this before. Like I'm familiar with what these people are doing, but I've never seen it in that context. I've seen other professions or other people, like you say, sort of put on that pedestal. And I don't know, there's a sort of a back and forth. There's a bit of tension about web dev Twitter and, making personalities or making celebrities out of those people. But I think what your shows have done is like really frame people as people and to sort of see them in that environment, and giving our industry a lot of respect. I think even if it is in a fun setting, it's still, I think it's still a very respectful and very entertaining way to look at somebody else's work, particularly when there's more of us like myself working at home, working on our own than ever before. Mm-hmm. It's the closest thing I have to seeing people collaborate in any format. So it's very cool.
This has been something that was like, I'm really happy to hear you say that, because it's something that I've been thinking a lot about, because in the developer thought leadership circles, there's kind of a tendency to represent opinions as facts. There's a tendency to represent a not knowing a thing as like an existential threat, like, learn this or you'll be replaced by robots, or like 10 things that you should never do as a developer. Like this sort of like FOMO based, like very anxiety ridden, sort of
you've got to be on the pre-alpha of the next framework, or you're
right. And it leads to what I think is just a general sense of dread in the industry, where people who are learning, like, I'm never going to learn all this. I'm never going to know enough to be able to do this. And so a really important thing for me in this content and in everything that I'm trying to build is to embrace the idea that, like, we don't know everything. And that's kind of what makes it fun. Like what makes this profession fun is that it truly is a bottomless rabbit hole. And even if we feel like we are the world's strongest expert in one thing, say you're Mark Erickson, you're working on Redux, you're probably one of the three most knowledgeable people in the world on Redux. Take him 2 steps to the right into CSS, and he's got a whole other rabbit hole that he could go down for the rest of his career, right? And similarly, somebody like Miriam Suzanne or Una Kravitz, who's like a world premiere expert on CSS and how those different things work in the browser, take them over into C#. Maybe they've never seen it at all, and they've got a whole new thing they can explore. This is the thing that's so exciting to me, is I will never be done learning. And every time I learn something, I have this opportunity to make something for the very first time. Right? Like, you get that experience of like, oh my God, I did it. I made it work. And that, it's so much fun. It can be so exciting. It can be such a joyful and playful experience if we can get over this sense that not knowing is somehow bad or shameful. Like, learning is the entire reason to do this profession. It's just such a blast to do it. And I really want that to come through. Like, it's an intention to collaborate and play and, teach each other and celebrate what each other is learning, and just recognize that, like, we're all at different places on this journey, and I'm going to be an expert in things that you're not, and you're going to be an expert in things that I'm not. And that's great news. Look how much we can teach each other.
Yeah. And I mean, in a fine-grained example, the episode of Web Dev Challenge that Sanity sponsored and that we were a part of there, I thought it was remarkable that Charlie Gerard, her application was I'll say it, the most creative of all four. And yet, like, if you had told someone, oh, that was written in Next.js, the framework, that people will have strong opinions on, but not just Next.js, was written in JavaScript, not TypeScript. So, like, if there's the fear of, oh, you can't do X because you didn't pick Y, it's like, no. Like, you can just pick the favorite, like the biggest framework that everyone's using and not even use TypeScript and still have a creative outcome. That's the reality. It's not the you have to be on the newest, latest, only this is the only thing that works sort of conversation.
Exactly.
When you are taking on ambitious content like this, are you familiar with The Gap by Ira Glass?
Is that, I think this is something that I've talked about a lot. It's sort of like how your taste is always better than your talent.
Yes. And so that thought of like, I know what it looks like in my head. I know what I'm trying to do. And I think that really blew me away with the episode that perhaps in particular that we filmed, we're a part of there, is just how much effort and how many people and how much gear it takes to make a product like that. And of course it does. And the end result is it just looks like a couple of people hanging out at a brewery and they're having fun, But like, that's a lot of resources and a lot of time. And then you look at the finished product. What I really wonder is, when you've taken on such ambitious things as you are now, are you happy with the outcome, or do you only see the flaws at the end of it?
Oh, I'm really happy with it.
Good. I'm someone who's never happy with my work, so that's what I wanted to ask.
And I think this is the part that is maybe the journey that I've been on has helped me sort of embrace this. But I spent a lot of time worrying that the things that I would make would never be good enough, and that would prevent me from doing. I would do a lot of prep, I would do a lot of research, and I would just try to get everything lined up before I could start. And that led to fewer really high effort projects that I was always disappointed in, because, like you said, my taste is far exceeds my talent. Like, I know what a good movie looks like, but if you asked me to go and make anything that even sort of resembled something in Hollywood, I'd fall flat on my face. And I know that. So if I were to say, well, I'm not going to make anything until I could recreate Oppenheimer, I mean, I'm going to be so disappointed every time I try.
Yeah.
And what I had to do instead was I had to embrace this idea that I want to be making things that are like 10% beyond what I think I'm capable of. And if I do that, I will be happy that the thing I did was bigger than I thought it could be, that it was, better looking, more technically intricate, or had some cool things going on that I didn't know how to do before. And I know that the next project is going to be 10% beyond that one. And, that's that way. I know that I'm leaving room for growth. I'm never going to jump from like today to a network ready show. I'm taking incremental steps where the thing that I made in January of 2024 compared to the thing I'm making now in January of 2025, there is a massive difference. And because I shipped, I don't know, 20 big projects in 24, I can look back and actually see the progression of like what I was capable of in the beginning of last year, what I'm capable of today, and also in just in the back end of things, what I'm able to do for the producer side of things, where I'm coordinating crew and who I'm working with, and my understanding of what different roles do on a production, and how to do stuff that I didn't know I would ever care about, like how to build a call sheet, how to put together a good craft services table, how to coordinate lunch orders for 35 people in a way that doesn't blow the schedule. Those sorts of things are not like nothing I ever sat down and said to myself, I want to be really good at that someday. But I'm also like really proud that I can do it, because it was something I never thought I would need to know. And it became necessary because I was pushing myself beyond what I'd done before. And as a result, I now know how to do that thing. And if I got called into a film shoot and they brought me on as a producer, I could like do that job now. I never would have thought that I'd be able to work as a producer on like a commercial project. But it turns out if you just do a little bit of the work every time and you always shoot a little bit higher, you start to build up a skill set, and you meet people who can give you feedback and show you tricks. And the people that I've worked with, every time they're like, oh, another producer I work with does it like this. I'm like, oh, that's genius. I should have been doing that the whole time. And I pick up that trick and I put it in my book, and now like I'm a little bit better.
Yeah, that makes sense, to focus on that incremental improvement. I feel like I'm constantly drawing allegories back to fitness because I enjoy running. But yeah, it's an expression to measure in months and not minutes. And yeah, to be able to look back at an entire year of work, because I always find that tension between, because I'll run like a bull at a gate at an idea. And but then I'm caught between that tension of, I should just get more reps in. I'll get better if I get more reps in. And it's like, but what if it was better because I held back like a week or a minute, to plan just that little bit better? And then it's just that push and pull of, do I get better by doing, or do I get better by planning? And trying to find out the middle ground there.
I think finding that balance is important, right? Because like I could never do a web dev challenge without weeks of planning and weeks of post. It just isn't. It's just, honestly, it's just not possible.
Not a production that scale, I'm guessing.
Yeah, because we've got 12 people, 15 people involved in the production. We've got 4 or 5 in post production. We've got to coordinate the travel for all of the devs. We got to there's so many things that have to happen in order to make it possible at the level that we're producing it, that there's just no way we could go fast. Like we couldn't put one of these out per week, I don't think, without adding a lot more people. Like we'd need, kind of overnight shifts and stuff if we wanted that to happen. And that, that was something that it does require that balance of saying, okay, well, I could sit on this for months and keep editing and keep trying to get it perfect and try to get more assets generated. Maybe I can hire an illustrator. Maybe I can get an animator. And all those things are things I want to do. Like I really desperately want to have an animator do like little mock-ups of the apps that we could do as overlays when people are describing them. I think that would be so freaking cool.
Like the British Bake Off illustration of the cake.
Exactly like that, right? Like I want to bring that vibe in, and I want to add. It is. It's so nice. Like, and it gives me some tools as the director to convey information very quickly that otherwise may have taken 90 seconds for somebody to explain because they were getting into a lot of context. I can distill it down into a couple lines of voiceover with an illustration that makes the point. We still get all that context, but now I don't have to cut a really good interaction from later because we needed the context of them explaining for 90 seconds. So it's little things that I know can help move the story along and help us keep in the human content, the fun content, without losing the information, right? But for me to do that, I have to like meet and interview the artists, and I have to extend timelines and all that kind of stuff. So I want to do it, but I'm not going to not produce the show until I have that aspect coordinated. There's a decent chance that in season 2 of Web Dev Challenge, somewhere in the middle of the season, we might see that feature come in. But it's not going to be ready for episode 1. Like,
but that's going to be that incremental improvement, right? Like if it's on the first episode, when you can make space for that. I was going to ask about when you've got a content schedule like that. Maybe it's less of a case because you're planning so many months in advance and sort of you're not making time-specific content typically. But I
Typically
guess,
not.
yeah. So when there's like an opportunity, so opportunistic content is something that I've been thinking about recently. So there's a meme going around, or something's happened in the news that you could make fun of, and you could jump on that thing. If you've got a content schedule laid out, have you ever been in a situation where, oh gee, I'd love to drop everything for a week and just try and get on the current trend? Or that probably doesn't fit the content that you're creating, but I'm wondering if you have occasions before where your content calendar has been at odds with an opportunity in the moment.
I no, but there's two pieces to that. One is, I don't believe a content calendar should ever be so packed that you can't just slip something else into it. So for example, I build Web Dev Challenge around an every 2 weeks release, and I build Elite Heat around an every 2 weeks release. And that averages out to a release every week when we've got both in full swing. I make one episode of Learn with Jason and one episode of a live streaming freeform thing. And there's plenty of room that if I wanted to like make a thing and get it out because it was timely, I could do that. But in all honesty, I'm just not that kind of person. I don't have the like let it rip personality that can see a meme and be like, let's make a meme, I've always been in awe of people like Cassidy Williams, who are so good at having a finger on the pulse of what's happening, what's everybody thinking about, and then they can just make something that it feels like it's exactly right for that moment. And even if she had released it 2 weeks later, it would have been like, nah, that was a while ago. We're not thinking about that anymore. She just has a knack for identifying something that is very resonant right now and making that. And it's not something I practice. It's not something that I really understand. It's just something that I appreciate.
Yeah, I mean, or of the people who can catch the zeitgeist. Like there's another, like a Reese Sullivan. I think he just joined Vercel, which is the current meme on Twitter. But every tweet, I'm like, how'd you do it? Like, how do you always come with a banger every time? But I'm out of that space too. How do you, and I know potentially this is a loaded question because the company I work for sponsored one of the episodes of your video last week, but there's this again, we speak about tensions like between creating content for corporations, because you've been on both sides of it, right? Like you were in the startup side, now you're sort of that independent creator but still working with companies. I have this theory that most developers are inherently cynical when they are being sold to, and so you sort of need to provide some amount of like that entertainment value, or like give them something of value, than to sort of take the medicine of well, this is brought to you by a sponsor, and it's similar sponsors for conferences and videos and this sort of thing. I'm wondering sort of how do you think about that space? Because it'd be great if we could all just make videos for fun, for nothing. But how do you feel about that, working with partners, finding, and I think too, I just wanted to mention, like, the way that you've creatively worked advertising into some of the newer episodes, like of Leet Heat with those, the infomercials and that. I think that's really cool, right? That's a new way to take on, well, we've all listened to ad reads in podcasts and we just skip past them. So because we feel like we're being sold to constantly. So like that infomercials is one very creative way to get around that. Was that in sort of direct response to the way that people feel like they're being sold to?
Yeah, I feel there's a couple things that I think might be interesting to touch on.
That was a long question. Sorry.
It was kind of a nesting doll of questions, but I
answer which ones ever you want and ignore the rest.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I'll start with the last one you asked, which was about the infomercial thing. That was not a direct response to advertising. That was actually a response to what I felt was a necessary component of a game show, which was the breather of throwing to commercial. And so when I go down a rabbit hole, I go hard. And so when I started thinking about Leet Heat, one of the first things I did was I watched every game show that's been running for many seasons, and I had a spreadsheet open and I did timings of like, how long did questions take to ask? How long between the opening and when they introduced the guests? How long did each round take? When are they doing all this stuff? And I started to like understand some of the rhythms in a show like Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune or whatever. And I noticed that there was sort of this like maximum amount of game that could be played before they needed a break. And they would do that with commercials. They would do that with meeting contestants. They would do that with round breaks. They would do it with mini games. But there was always something. You couldn't just like game for 25 minutes and then call it a show, because people just, they got to breathe, right? You need a second to think, okay, what did we just do? Let me process. Let me think about what's next. Okay, we're getting ready for round 2. So I wanted these natural breaks, and natural is a very loaded term in television. So it was very much okay. Well, what do? They throw to commercial. It'd be kind of funny to have Mark throw to commercial, but I don't want to have to sell commercials. So what if we just made all these like half-baked skit ideas that we were never going to make otherwise, and pretended they were commercials for like other TV shows or something like that? And that gave us a chance to do things that I think are really unhinged and creative, that just don't really have a place anywhere else. Like, they're not really educational. Sure. They're not really long enough to be standalone. It's like, I don't know. I have this weird idea. What should I do? Well, I can make 15 seconds of video to make a fake episode of MTV Cribs. Like, why not?
And so, maybe that's like maybe you stumble upon the next great idea doing that. Like, it's just scratching your own itch, following those things. Yeah.
We did think about that a little bit too, is like, well, if we've got an idea that's only half baked, what if we make a trailer for that show?
Yeah.
And if we get a really strong response to that trailer, that's a good signal that we could, maybe we experiment, make a pilot. Yeah. And so we're kicking around some things like that. It's also just an excuse to talk to people I really like working with, like Annie Sexton, Joel Hooks, my wife, Marissa. They all are very creative people, and they're very funny, and they all live around here. And so it's an opportunity for us to get together, do a real writer's room, throw things at the wall. And if we're all laughing, we just start writing it down, and that's our next bad commercial idea. And so that's kind of thing one. But it did create this opportunity where if a company wants to get involved, like Dino, for example, sponsored the nuggets that we're using for hot sauce and lead heat, which was one of those, like, my friend Cam Hermans, we did play testing of the show. And as we were talking about like the bites and stuff, I said I was going to get Dino nuggies, because I thought that was funny, that like because I didn't want to do hot wings. I didn't want this to be like a straight up rip off of the format of hot ones. So I was like, well, we do need something. You can't just eat a spoonful of hot sauce. So I was like, well, a chicken nugget makes sense, but what if we got dinosaur nuggets, because that's funny? And then he was like, well, why don't you just do Dino nuggies? And I was like, that's brilliant. I emailed Dino immediately, and I was like, hey, I got this idea. And it turns out they had already built like the assets and art for a Dino Nuggie campaign. Huh. So it was just very like right place, right time. They had the assets. They didn't know what to do. I had the format, and it was like, oh, perfect. Like, you already did the thing that we wanted to do. So we kind of came at it from opposite sides. And then they made some commercials for these Dino Nuggies that are unhinged that they sent, and we ran as part of the commercial break. And so there's an opportunity there to like integrate with sponsors, to just let them get their weird ideas out. And also in a way that I think makes the community recognize that like we're all just people trying to make cool stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so that goes back to the first question you asked about like devs being cynical and resisting advertising. I don't think that's true unless we treat them like children that need to be tricked into eating their vegetables, right? Like, we all want to know how to be better at our jobs. We all want to know what the current tools are that can help us do better work. We want to have a finger on the pulse. We don't want to be told that we're not capable of existing without a given tool. We don't want to be told that we are, missing out or terrible if we're not using a tool. And we certainly don't want to be told that a tool does things that it's not going to do. Like, if I have one more company tell me that AI is going to replace developers or give me a fully functional human being that's actually a robot, like, don't patronize me. Right? I know that's not true. So tell me what it does and tell me what it sucks at, and let me fit it into my workflow with knowledge of the trade-offs. And I think that was one of my big motivations, was to get away from the idea of an ad read, because an ad read is like, we'll talk about these features that we like about our product, and instead get toward like integration, like product placement for real. Let's build with the thing as part of the story that we want to tell. And people are going to see, like, look what these devs were able to build. Here's what they thought was cool about it. They're going to naturally talk about the things they thought were cool because we like to try things and then share our experiences. That's a human, like a human trait. And at the end, like, we do a challenge. Everybody uses Sanity, and the stuff that they struggle with, they see that. They see when they have to call you over and ask, like, hey, how do I do this? And they also see the parts where everybody's eyes light up and they go, dang, that's really cool that it just worked. Right. And to me, that's such a more compelling reason for me to try a tool is if I see a bunch of devs using it and their eyes keep lighting up as they're using the tool, I want to go use that tool. Right.
Yeah.
And I'm not sad that companies are willing to sponsor things because like we all can think of a few companies that if they were to sponsor an episode of the Web Dev Challenge, that is not going to go well. Like that integration is going to be hard and the devs are going to be frustrated and things aren't going to work and they're going to be opening support tickets. Like you can't fake this stuff, right?
Yeah,
you have to have a product that's actually nice to use. And that's one of the first things I talk to these companies about is I'm like, look, we got 4 hours and I'm not going to lie, right? Like we can paper things over if you've got like a little outage or something, but like if you ship a product that doesn't fundamentally do what you say it does, that's going to be really, really clear in this format.
It's going to be impossible to edit around.
Yeah. I am not going to like fake a screen that has a working product. I'm going to show what these devs come up with. And if they come up with nothing because they couldn't get through your onboarding, that's not going to look great for you. And I've had companies walk away because they realized 4 hours wasn't enough time given the state of their DX and onboarding.
Far out.
And I think that to me, that's the right way to approach this stuff is to think about how do we use these tools in a way that really lets us tell a good story and so that other developers can make actual assessments of what they could be using or how other people are getting problems done.
Yeah. And that's cool to think that as you're building out the series and with the more episodes that you're creating, like the more trust that's being built up, that if it was a product featured on Web Dev Challenge, then it must be good because like that they've only worked with tools that they're able to produce actual outcomes with. So you're sort of building that trust episode by episode. So no, that's really cool. I have so many other questions that I was going to ask, but we're running long. There's one I'm very keen about, and it's I think it's something that I've seen you talk about publicly before as well. But I thought I'd at least ask it here while I've got you. Measuring impact. How closely do you pay attention to the numbers of the episodes? Because I know a lot of these things are like you've sort of got to put the content out there, and you're looking for that word of mouth. But I know YouTube can be very analytical. You can dive really deeply into the numbers, but how much of what you're doing at the moment is governed by the numbers that you can get to measure the impact of what you're creating versus, because I know, I can feel it as well, that the content that you're creating is so unlike anything else that it must have an impact. So I'm wondering, how far do you dive into the analytics, or are you sort of following a creative vibe at the moment?
I'm trying to balance, right? Because if the analytics aren't good, people won't hire me to make more stuff. And so there is just sort of an inherent requirement that this needs to land with developers in a real way, and they need to be willing to watch it and share it. Because if they don't, then there's no incentive for any companies to get involved. And I'm running productions that are just so complicated and expensive to make that without that partnership, it's just not going to happen. So I have to be really mindful of, doing something that is valuable to developers, that they are going to be interested in, that they will be willing to share. And I have to be mindful of like, at the same time, I need to make something that I'm proud of, because if I feel like I'm on a treadmill of making content that's just to please the algorithm, one, I think that's a very losing battle. I think that it sort of backs you into being somebody that you don't want to be. And I think we can point to some examples of that across the community where people started making the thing that performed best and not the thing that they wanted to make. And you sort of watch them become a persona as opposed to a person. And I don't ever want that to be the case. I would rather have my videos struggle a little bit as I'm trying to figure out the right way to do it that feels good for me than to do it in a way that is more successful, but at the expense of like sort of becoming a caricature of who I want to be. that is a tough thing, right? Because simplifying and flattening yourself out into sort of a 2D persona is a great way to make the things you do very understandable.
Yeah.
And understandable things are easy to share. They're easy to have strong feelings about. It's easier to gain big fans and big critics, and all of that creates the sort of discourse that can lead to much higher viewership. But it also leads to like the kinds of viewership I don't want. I don't want people to hate watch my stuff just to find things to be mad about. I'd rather people watch my stuff and have nuanced discussions about what's on it, because we're all complicated people. And I do think that there's, I also don't want to be somebody who's so focused on building things that are technically impressive that I end up with like art films. I think that there are definitely moments where I watch a TV show or an independent film or something like that, and it's so clear that what they did was technically challenging and really well created, and the craft is there, and I hated every second of it. It was just, it's very clearly like the only thing they cared about was how technically cool the thing they were working on was. And I feel that way about like a lot of stuff. There's products that I've worked with. There's tools that I've worked with where, you install it and you go to look at it. You're like, this is very technically impressive. And it feels like handling a box of knives where the handles are made of knives. And I don't want to do that. Like, that's not fun for me, but good for you for being such a great engineer. And the same thing when I watch read a book that's just way too up its own art. And the same with movies, like where I'm just like, I feel like I have to like take notes and go to Wikipedia to figure out what the hell you're talking about. And that's not for me. Like, that's not my kind of thing. So I want to make sure that I'm progressing in the skill side of things, but never at the expense of the story. And then I don't want to make the story so clout chasey that they end up being at odds with sort of the long-term vision of being a real person who makes interesting stuff.
Yeah, I don't think I'm destined for great creative success, but I do imagine it would be a potential fear of, if you optimize for the algorithm, you end up creating things that you hate, and then it just creatively bankrupt because I have to keep going and doing the thing that I'm not happy with. And but that's what gets the results. So, but I was also thinking about that movie analogy too. I'm not a movie buff, but every time I watch one of those critically acclaimed films, I'll watch it and think, look, I understand why people think this is very well made, but it was no fun. And I'm someone who prefer to have fun than sort of sit back and say, technically very interesting.
And like there's a lot of examples of where you can do both, right? Like Everything Everywhere All at Once was one of those movies that was simultaneously extremely impressive technically, really impressive from like a creativity and writing standpoint, and a whole lot of fun to watch.
Yeah.
And I think that's, to me, that's sort of the bar, is like, how do we push all of the envelopes at the same time? And I think that that's always kind of a lightning strikes moment when you get a movie like that, because it's just it's so uncommon for somebody to hit all cylinders. But I think that it is possible, and I think that's, to me, that's kind of what I'm striving for, is how can I make something that people really like, that I'm really proud of, that was really fun to make, that's really fun to watch, that people will want to share, and that people who don't necessarily code would still find fun to watch, but people who code it find it deep enough that they can get some value out of it. Like, there's a way to do all this stuff where it could hit every single thing and people just go, dang, this was perfect. I have no idea what that is, and I don't know how to get there, but I do fully intend to keep trying.
Well, that's why there's only so many Everything Everywhere All at Onces, isn't there? Because it's something to hit. But I do look forward to your next series of multi-dimensional web dev challenges. That's going to be a real interesting watch. I need to wrap this up, but is there anything that you feel I haven't covered? Is there any insight we've left on the table here that we could have covered before we finish?
I mean, I guess, like, at the risk of being one of those people who just spouts off advice that seems very relevant only to myself, I think that one of the things that I've heard many times and that I try to dispel is people will talk to me and they'll be like, it's just so cool that you get to do that. And it's said with a tone of like, I have some kind of special privilege or special buy-in that allows me to do this. And I like to very strongly point out that everything that I'm doing is something that I've been working on for years, and it's something that no one understood or gave me permission to do. And I did it because I felt like I saw something interesting that I was really curious about, and there was a thread that I couldn't help but tug at. And anybody can do this. It just takes time and consistency and focus and a willingness to be vulnerable about not knowing stuff and doing it a little worse than you think you probably could, and then just doing it again because now you learned something new. Anything I'm making today that looks like it was that, people will say like, oh, this looks like it could be a Netflix show, and I'm like, maybe someday, right? I don't think it could be a Netflix show because I can see all the edges that a Netflix exec would probably look at and go, why'd you do that? And I'm like, you great question. But I can also see the difference between what I'm doing now and what I did in 2018 when I first started streaming and coming up with the concept of Learn with Jason.
Yeah.
But that was 2018. I've been doing this for 7 years now, weekly. Like I make some kind of video almost every week for 7 years now. And I've always been thinking about how can I push it a little bit further and go a little bit harder and make it a little bit more fun to watch and a little bit better. And so it's very much like within everybody's grasp. You just got to be patient and you got to be diligent about it. And there's nothing special about me. I just kept showing up.
That's it. Don't sit back and wait. No, it's that classic statement, right? Like it took 7 years for you to become an overnight success. Like
Right.
if people are only
Right.
just discovering you now, it's because you've been grinding for the last few years at it. So no, that's cool. Very good. So thanks for joining me on this little podcast. So I'll leave you to go back and produce your much larger content. But yeah, very happy that you're out there doing what you're doing at the moment, and no one's doing it like you. So thanks for coming on.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.